right. Eighth section on chapter 2, class struggle and other paradigms. As we can see, the theory of class struggle seeks to shed light on the historical process as such. It is a type of explanation that is opposed to other kinds of explanation. We can understand the latter, and as a result, arrive at a better understanding of the former if we take a look at the theoretical challenges which 19th century culture had to face. What particularly stood in need of investigation was the reasons for the irresistible rise of the West. To put it in the enthusiastic terms employed at the start of the first Opium War by de Tocqueville, it was a question of clarifying the multitude of events of the same kind that are gradually impelling the European race beyond its borders and subjecting all other races in succession to its dominion and influence. The reason for the subjugation of 4/5 of the world by the remaining fifth. End quote. What was this triumphal march to be attributed to? Secondly, it was necessary to explain France's differential political development compared with Britain and the USA. In France, revolution had been followed by counter-revolution, which in its turn paved the way for a subsequent revolution. A succession of political regimes followed one another: absolute monarchy, constitutional monarchy, Jacobin terror, military dictatorship, empire, democratic republic, Bonapartism, and so forth. And no end to these convulsions. With the advent of an orderly regime of liberty and the rule of law was in sight. In fact, on closer inspection, with the exception of brief intervals, absolute power presented itself as a destiny or a curse. Divine right, monarchy was followed by the Jacobin terror, which in its turn paved the way for Bonapartiste dictatorship. What a striking contrast with the gradual constructive evolution of the other two countries, characterized by liberty and the rule of law. So, what were the reasons for the interminable historical crisis engulfing France? Thirdly, even as it engaged in its colonial expansion, the West anxiously observed the interruption at home of shocking mass movements, which, in the shape first of Jacobinism and then of socialism, seemed to be attacking the very foundations of civilization. What was happening? Let us now glance in broad terms at the paradigms employed by the culture of the time to confront these three major theoretical and political cruises. In 1883, the year Marx died, a book appeared in Austria by Ludwig Gomplewix, which its very title, The Race Struggle, was counterposed to the thesis of the class struggle as a key to interpreting history. 3 decades before, Arthur de Gobineau in France began to send to the printers his essay on the inequality of human races, a work whose title once again speaks for itself. At the same time, a similar line of argument was advanced in Britain by Benjamin Disraeli, who formulated the thesis that race was, quote, the key of history. All is race, there is no other truth, end quote. Furthermore, quote, there is only one thing which makes race, and that is blood, end quote. The whole historical cycle from the discovery conquest of America to the Opium Wars and the rise and triumph of the British Empire perfectly illustrated the decisive character of the racial factor. Only thus could it be understood. How? Though few in number, the Spanish conquistadores had triumphed in America and the British in China. The racial or ethnological racial paradigm can be presented in a diluted form and refer primarily to what in contemporary terminology would be called the clash of civilizations. Obviously, civilizations generally exist and are not to be confused with races. But if, rather than being construed on the basis of historically determined context and conflicts, they are regarded as expressions of a tendentially eternal spirit or soul, there's a danger of a naturalistic slippage. The civilization contrasted by Tocqueville with Western civilization or the Christian world all seem incomparably inferior in value and immobile in time, and are therefore destined by Providence to disappear. At this point, there is a strong tendency to abandon the terrain of history, The slippage into naturalism proves unstoppable when the discourse focuses on semi-civilized tribes and savages the European race, quote, the European race has received from heaven or acquired by its own efforts such uncontestable superiority over and other races that make up the great human family that the man placed by us on account of his vices and ignorance on the bottom rung of social scale is still first among savages. End quote. We can readily understand the French liberals' horror at something that had occurred in Australia. Transported white European prisoners had escaped into the forests, married the daughters of Aborigine savages, proceeding to a miscegenation that engendered a race of half caste, dangerous to the existing social and racial order. 12 years after Marx, Engels died. The date was 1895, the year which Gustave Le Bon published Crowd Psychology. The book's main thesis is well known. The prolonged crisis from 1789 to 1871, from the outbreak of the Great Revolution to the Paris Commune, was ultimately the product of mental illness. Here, then, 19th century bourgeois culture tackled the second theoretical and political challenge by recourse to the psychopathological paradigm. In the country stamped by an interminable revolutionary cycle, a virus of a new and unknown kind raged, which had attacked the mental faculties of generations of intellectuals and political agitators. Such was the view of Tocqueville as of Hippolyte Taine and Le Bon himself. But why did this virus rage in one country rather than another? The fact was, lamented Tocqueville, that the French were lacking in the stable morality, strong common sense, and love of liberty and individual dignity exhibited by Anglo-Saxons, in particular Americans. The French frequently succumbed to the delirium of ideological abstractions and exhibited a morbid attachment to equality and even homogenization. They were afraid of isolation and harbored a desire to be in the crowd, feeling themselves members of a nation that marches to the same step in perfect alignment. They regarded liberty as the least important of their possessions and thus are always ready to offer it up with reasons at moments of danger. There were characteristics whose disappearance was difficult to imagine, given people whose basic characteristics are so constant that we can recognize the France we know in portraits made of it 2 or 3 thousand years ago. End quote. As we can see, the psychopathological paradigm tends to intersect with the ethnological or ethnological racial paradigm. This applies to Taine as well as Le Bon, who, to explain the insanity, delirium, and convulsions of revolutionary France, adverted to morbid crowd psychology, but more exactly the morbid crowd psychology of Latins, who were wanting in the sentiments of the independence of the individual so powerful in the Anglo-Saxon. Such stereotypes became even more widely diffused across the Channel, and even found in John Stuart Mill. He contrasted the orderly liberty and economic development of the Anglo-Saxon world with the submission, endurance, and statism peculiar to the continental nations of Europe, which, moreover, were run with bureaucracy and envious of egalitarian impulses. Thus, even in liberal Britain, albeit in less crudely naturalistic forms, we find a conjunction of the psychopathological paradigm, which attributed a protracted historical crisis to a sick psyche, and the ethnological paradigm, which detected the sick in psyche in specific people. In Tocqueville, the naturalistic slippage of the psychopathological paradigm is more pronounced. Having died in 1859, he did not live to see the American Civil War, but had sensed its advent. What were the causes of the impending cataclysm? Ideological fanaticism, which had such devastating effects in the country of radical enlightenment, and Jacobinism was absent across the Atlantic. So, what was the cause of the looming Civil War? The French liberal was in no doubt. It was the rapid introduction into the United States of men who were foreign to the English race. It was the sudden arrival. The French liberal was in no doubt. It was the, quote, rapid introduction into the United States of men who were foreign to the English race. It was the sudden arrival of so many alien elements who disastrously altered the nature and economy and health of the original social body, end quote. Finally, to explain the eruption of the subaltern classes onto the historical stage and the emergence of the Jacobin socialist movement, 19th century culture employed the same admixture of psychological paradigm and ethnological paradigm. In Tocqueville's view, socialism was the natural disease of the French, and this was Le Bon's position too. At the same time, it availed itself of the racial paradigm to bond the subaltern classes who rebelled against the existing order as barbaric and savage. What was occurring was a new barbarian invasion, this time originating from within the civilized world. Indeed, wrote Nietzsche, commenting on the Paris Commune and condemning it, a barbaric slave class was at work that threatened to visit horrendous destruction on civilization. Or to put the point in the words of Jeremy Bentham, this time nothing good was to be expected of the savage that was the poor man. As we can see, the main paradigms employed by bourgeois culture, especially in the second half of the 19th century, allotted very little space to history. This explains some extraordinary slips. Tocqueville counterposed the USA to France incapable of ridding itself of absolute power. We are in a period that predates the American Civil War, the country where black slavery remained alive and well was celebrated as champion of the cause of liberty, while deafness to the cause was embodied by a country that had abolished slavery in its colonies decades earlier. It was in disputing these paradigms that Marx and Engels developed the theory of class struggle. Section 9. The formation of the theory of class struggle. Tackling the issues of the working class on the terrain of historical and social analysis is the 27-year-old Marx not only ridiculed cries of alarm at the new barbarism invasion, but turned them back against those who uttered them. It was precisely from these barbarians that emancipation was to be anticipated. The barbaric slave class warned against by Nietzsche and the culture of the time was the working class which, breaking the chains of present enslavement to which it was subject, made a decisive contribution to constructing a society and civilization no longer based on exploitation and oppression. The racial and civilization clash paradigms were refuted in advance on the grounds that concrete social historical analysis disclosed the fluidity of the boundaries between civilization and barbarism. This did not only apply to class relations within the capitalist metropolis. The latter claimed to export civilization to the colonial world. In reality, it was precisely there that the inherent barbarism of bourgeois civilization clearly manifested itself. During the Civilization War, represented by the Opium War, according to the dominant ideology in the West, Tocqueville and Mill as well, it was the semi-barbarian China which showed respect for the principle of morality. In any event, colonial expansion was not the triumph ordained and consecrated by Providence of the superior civilization and the European race about which Tocqueville, among others, fantasized. Rather, it was a key moment in the formation of the world market by the bourgeoisie, which had emerged, dripping from head to toe from every pore with blood and dirt. With its class struggle, the Western bourgeoisie had imposed an international division of labor based on the enslavement of blacks and the expropriation, deportation, and even annihilation of Native Americans. The class struggle of oppressed peoples did not fail to respond to all of this. As regards interpretation of the major historical crisis that began in 1789, from the outset, Marx developed an analysis in which race, the stereotypical characteristics attributed to this or that people, and madness played no role. In 1850, he published Class Struggles in France from 1848 to 1850. The methodology clearly formulated in the title also forms the guiding thread of a book published 2 years later, The 18th Brumaire of Louis Bonaparte. It was developed to explain why the revolutionary crisis, after having variously invested all classes and parties, resulted in the dictatorship of Bonaparte, that chief of the lumpen proletariat, a princely lumpen proletariat. It made no sense to counterpose Britain and the USA to France's supposedly incurable death to the value of liberty. Let me read that again. It made no sense to counterpose Britain and the USA to a France supposedly incurably deaf to the value of liberty. Britain distinguished itself by the indecent haste with which, prior to anyone else, it recognized the France issuing from Louis Bonaparte's coup d'état, whose author was deified by the conservative press. As for the North American Republic, even were blacks even were black slavery to be ignored, it must be remembered that across the Atlantic, the class contradictions are but incompletely developed. Every clash between the classes is concealed by the outflow of the surplus proletarian population of the West, and emigration presupposing the expropriation and deportation of the natives, and hence a ferocious dictatorship over them. Departure from naturalistic paradigms was an essential moment in the process of developing the theory of class struggle. Already in his early writings, Engels criticized Thomas Carlyle, quote, with his prejudice in favor of the Teutonic character, for his exaggerated and one-sided condemnation of the Irish national character, end quote. Rather than drawing attention to the, quote, shameless oppression inflicted by the English, end quote, the great writer had wrongly stigmatized the inhabitants of the subjugated island, Latins and Celts, members of a race robbed of all humanity, starkly inferior to the Germanic or Saxon race, of which the English formed an integral part. It is also the context wherein to locate Marx's critique of the dominant ideology, which claimed to attribute the tragedy of a people to the aboriginal faults of the Celtic race. What should be put on trial was not some putative Irish nature, but British misrule, and hence the responsibility of the dominant classes. There were the years when the Irish, who occupied the bottom rungs of the labor market in England, seemed to Carlyle to be not only Latins and Celts, but also worse, Negroes, members of the race whose slavery the British writer would would focus in particular on the USA justified. Unfortunately, this view was also widespread among British workers, who, Marx observed in 1870, tended to adopt toward the Irish a similar attitude that displayed in the American South by poor whites toward the N-words they despised and hated. But all this had little or nothing to do with race. In a society of the kind to be found in the Deep South, where even after the formal abolition of the institution of slavery, the ruling oligarchy proudly displayed its odium and saddled blacks with all the productive labor. Social arrogance manifested itself as racial arrogance, and contempt for the productive labor was at the same time contempt for the servile or semi-servile race forced to supply it. Along with Carlyle, Marx and Engels' polemic targeted François Guizot, who, after the workers' revolt of June 1848, like Tocqueville, and probably in his wake, contrasted England and France. The first knew how to combine love of liberty with a robust pragmatism. The second was prey to a fanatical subservience and lacking sense of limits. Hence, ironized Marx, everything was to be explained by the superior intelligence of the English. Class struggle, conflict that was always historically determined, ceded to a mythical, more or less eternal nature of peoples possessing a different degree of pragmatism and sense of reality. Those who argued thus took no account of the radicalism and civil war that marked the First English Revolution, the Puritan Revolution. The latter, however, was attributed by Guizot to a few ambitious, fanatics, and evil-minded people, not content with moderate freedom. Directed at the French, the ethnological paradigm gives way to the psychopathological paradigm, which sets off in search of fanatics and lunatics. The terrain of an understanding of history is abandoned here too. This was of this way of arguing seems so ridiculous to Marx and Engels that they pointed to adhesion to the ethnological and psychopathological paradigms as evidence of a decline in the capacité de la bourgeoisie. Terrified by the specter of proletarian revolution, it was no longer capable of interpreting social conflict in historical terms. Whether directly or indirectly, the polemic of the theoreticians of the class struggle ended up encompassing a fair number of the major authors of the 19th century. According to Tocqueville, The vehicle of the virus of a new unknown kind was a new race of revolutionaries. We are still dealing with the same man, but the circumstances are different. One has the impression that Engels was replying to the French liberal when in 1851 he waxed ironic about the superstition which attributes revolutions to the ill will of a few agitators. In denouncing an eruption of revolutionary insanity, 19th century liberals had France in particular in their sights. In the conviction that the revolutionary cycle afflicting the West went back a long way, Nietzsche called for a settlement of accounts with the madhouse world of entire millennia and the mental illness originating with Christianity. Although taking the psychopathological paradigms to extremes, Nietzsche acknowledged his debt to the tradition behind him and declared that he had passed through the school of Tocqueville and Taine. On the other side, Engels mocked Taine and Tocqueville, those idols of the Philistines. The various representatives of the dominant 19th century culture were therefore in agreement in identifying France with the protracted revolutionary cycle as a clear example of the horrors in which revolutionary madness could result. In 1885, Engels, by contrast, asserted that France was the land where more than anywhere else, historical class struggles were each time fought out to a decision. For his part, Marx expressed utter contempt for the psychopathological paradigm, noting in 1867 that autocratic feudal Russia employed it. Nicholas I explained the spread of the 1848 revolutionary crisis in Europe by the diffusion of the French plague and French revolutionary madness with the metastasis of the cancer of a sacrilegious philosophy, attacking the healthy organs of the European social body. Okay, how are we looking here? Number 10. Okay, I'll do 10 and then split it up from 11 to 13 for the second. Okay, number 10, class struggles and ideological struggle. Class struggle not only encompasses different social relations, but it also played out as an ideological level, not sparing religion. The latter claims to be sacred space that transcends conflict. In reality, it often acts as an opium of the people, facilitating the task of the ruling class. It is worth dwelling on this point because Marx's discourse on religions has been diffused with Enlightenment discourse, which risks compromising an understanding of the Marxian critique of ideology. For Marx's religion is one of the ideologies, not ideology as such. The concrete role played by religion in the context of the class struggle in its various configurations has to be examined. Let us take a glance at history. In the late 18th century, Poland was still formally a sovereign state. Frederick II of Prussia exploited the anti-Catholic sentiments of the Enlightenment philosophies to justify the annexation of Polish territory, presenting it as a contribution to the division of enlightenment and defense of the cause of religious tolerance. In a letter sent to him, D'Alembert celebrated the delicious verses of the enlightened sovereign, which, in a felicitous blend of imagination and reason, mocked the Poles and the Holy Virgin Mary, in whom they reposed their hopes of liberation. Something similar occurred in connection with Ireland, a colony of Protestant and Anglican Great Britain. Here too, the struggle against national oppression was fueled by religious themes and mobilized watchwords of religious Roman Catholic kind. In this instance, it was John Locke who seized on the spirit of enlightenment to combat the rebels, a manifestation of the ignorant and zealot world of popery, led astray by the art and industry of their clergy. They were incited by priests who everywhere, to secure their empire, have excluded reason from having anything to do with religion. There could be no toleration of papists. In addition, to look into a foreign hostile power, they harbored dangerous opinions which were absolutely destructive of all governments but the popes. Those opinions, and whoever shall spread or publish any of them, the magistrate is bound to suppress. In both cases, the alleged struggle against clerical obscurantism was, at the same time, repression of the national aspirations of the Polish and Irish people. Proudhon may be regarded as the inheritor of such Enlightenment ideology. In him, we find a combination of the posture of a freethinker and derision of independence movements for which defense of national identity also took the form of defense of religious identity. Marx and Engels' attitude was very different. From the outset, commitment to the struggle for the emancipation of subaltern classes, often stupefied and paralyzed by religious opium, was conjoined with support for independence movements, which precisely thanks to religion, achieved initial awareness of the national question. In the eyes of the British, noted the young Engels, the Protestant intruders were one and the same as the landlords, and in a way, an integral part of the machine subjugating the people who had been invaded and subjected to the most brutal plundering. Digging beneath the surface of the religious clash between Catholics and Protestants, we encounter the clash between Irish farmhands, whose land was often expropriated, and the expropriating British colonists. We witness the emergence of the reality of class struggle in its concrete configuration. Religious affiliation can be experienced very intensely and mobilize effectively in political and historical upheaval, but it is not the primary cause of such conflict. In the case of Poland, immediately after the rebellion of January 1863, Marx, reconstructing the history of the partitioned, oppressed country, observed that Tsarist Russia had not hesitated to use the pretext of exclusion of non-Catholic dissidents from the political rights to justify its policy of intervention and expansion at Poland's expense. This is a theme subsequently developed by Engels. At the same time of the country's first partition, there was an Enlightenment public opinion in Europe under the immense influence of Diderot, Voltaire, Rousseau, and other French writers of the 18th century. In, it, in its expansionist march, Tsarist Russia exploited it. Although engaged in ferocious persecution of Jewry, it came soon upon Poland in the name of religious toleration, and the rights of Orthodox Christians infringed by a Catholic, obscure country and government. In so doing, Russia could count on the support and the benevolence of the philosophies. Quote, the court of Catherine II was made the headquarters of the Enlightenment men of the day, especially the Frenchmen. The most Enlightenment principle was professed by the Empress and her court. So well did she succeed in deceiving them that Voltaire and many others sang the praise of the Semiramis of the North, and proclaimed Russia the most progressive country in the world, the home of liberal principles, the champions of religious toleration. End quote. The date was 1866. The following year, we have seen Marx telling Engels about his daughter Jenny paying tribute to the Irish patriots who'd just been hanged and associating them with the Polish patriots who were also fighting for their independence. This was not prompted by some fleeting emotion. In 1869, Marx returned to the issue. He sent a photo of Jenny first to Engels and then to Ludwig Kugelmann, and explained in the accompanying letter that the cross she was wearing around her neck was the Polish 1864 insurrection cross. In the house of the philosopher, revolutionary and scourge of the opium of the people, there was no hesitation in expressing solidarity with the liberation struggle of an oppressed people to the extent of displaying its religious symbols. Attention to the concrete significance of religion in a concrete historical situation and in the context of a specific conflict was a constant in Marx and Engels' thinking. During the American Civil War, Marx warmly stressed the vanguard role played by Christian abolitionists like William L. Garrison and Wendell Phillips. The latter in particular, quote, for 30 years, has without intermission, and at the risk of his life, proclaimed the emancipation of the slaves as his battle cry, regardless alike of the persiflage of the press an enraged house of paid rowdies, and the conciliatory representations of solicitous friends. End quote. Indeed, he did not hesitate to criticize Lincoln, reproving him for relying mainly on negotiations from above with the leaders of states situated in the border between North and South, and uncertain about what position to adopt rather than on mobilizing from below of black determined to break. Sorry, let me read that. In, Indeed, he, meaning Marx, did not hesitate to criticize Lincoln, reprobing him for relying mainly on negotiations from above with the leaders of states situated on the border between North and South, and uncertain about what position to adopt, rather than on mobilization from below of blacks determined to break their chains of slavery. Quote, Lincoln is waging a political war, end quote. Such was the condemnation by Phillips, who wanted to transform the military showdown between the two sections of the Union into the kind of abolition revolution for which Marx likewise hoped. Okay, hold on. I know I'm having such a hard time with this paragraph. In attention to the concrete significance of a concrete, during the Marx formally stressed the vanguard role played by the latter in particular for 30. Okay, so he is referring to Wendell Phillips. Okay, so not Marx. So Wendell Phillips criticized Lincoln, reproving him for mainly wanting to negotiate with leaders of the South and North instead of mobilizing. Um, Black people wanted to be freed. Okay, let's continue. The great opponent of Christian abolitionism was John C. Calhoun, who thundered against the rabid fanatics who regard slavery as a sin, and those regarding it deem it their highest duty to destroy it, even though it involved the destruction of the Constitution and the Union. For them, abolition was conscientious duty. Only thus, they thought, could they free themselves from the agonizing sense of being complicit with the unforgiven sin allegedly represented by slavery, against which they proclaimed a general crusade. Despite his hatred, or perhaps precisely because of it, Calhoun hit home. In Christian abolitionism, quasi-fundamentalist accents were not lacking, with which the major theories of the slaveholding South liked to contrast a secular attitude that was enlightened in its way. Yet Marx came down in favor of Garrison and Phillips, celebrating them as champions of the cause of liberty. In the gigantic class struggle that unfolded before and during the Civil War, it was Christian abolitionism, often echoing with fundamentalist accent, which embodied resistance to the general crusade of property against labor and the revolutionary cause of the emancipation of labor. Not only as militants required to take a position on the conflicts of their time, but also as historians analyzing conflicts that now lay in the past, the remote past even, Marx and Engels carefully avoided indiscriminate liquidation of movements inspired by religion in one way or another. In its time, the Spanish uprising against Napoleon's army had been directed against the invading country's cultural tradition, as well as its military occupation. Hence, it had denounced the French Enlightenment and Revolution, and against these more or less satanic ideas, appealed to the religion of the ancestor of the Holy Faith. But all this did not prevent Marx from formulating a balanced judgment in 1854 that in the Napoleonic era, quote, all the wars of independence waged against France bear in common the stamp of regeneration mixed up with reaction. Regeneration was represented by the mass struggle of national independence, while reaction consisted in the obscurantist ideology informing the struggle. Immediately after the failure of 1848 revolution, rejecting tendencies to discouragement and escapism, Engels engaged in reconstructing the German revolutionary tradition, and thus wrote a book on the Peasant War, the great anti-feudal revolt that had erupted more than 3 centuries earlier, in the wake of the Protestant Reformation, with slogans drawn from the Old and New Testaments. Later, at the end of his life in 1895, Engels had no hesitation comparing the irresistible rise of socialism with the triumph of Christianity, notwithstanding Diocletian's persecution and thanks to Constantine's conversion. This stance was all the more significant because it occurred at the same time as Nietzsche's equation and condemnation of Christianity and socialism in the name of first of enlightenment proper and then in the final phase of his development of a new enlightenment. Finally, it is worth remembering that very early Marxist polemical Marx polemicized against Gustav Hugo, who posturing as a complete skeptic, even more consistent than the other enlighteners, ridiculed the idea of the emancipation of slaves, not infrequently fostered, as we have seen, by Christian abolitionists. In Marx and Engels, then, religion was represented as an opium of the people, and as much as it claims to transcend conflict, uh, thereby impeding attainment of revolutionary consciousness and strengthening the chains of oppression. But it may be that religion is the terrain where rudimentary consciousness of the conflict or class struggle in its various configurations emerges. This is the case in particular with the national question. In such instances, religious representation, which explained the conflict on the basis of a clash between Irish Catholics and British Protestants, or between Polish Catholics and Russian Orthodox Christians, is much less idealistic and much less mystificatory than the views that sees Enlightenment and obscurantism at grips in Ireland and Poland. Transfiguration, domination into an expression of the light of reason, such Illuminism, dear to Frederick II, and in part de Lambert, as to Hugo, Calhoun, and Nietzsche, might well be defined as the court enlightenment. And we must then never lose sight of the fact that the critique of religion cannot be separated in Marx and Engels from the critique of court enlightenment. All right, stop this one.